Here we are with the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. And one of the first things that we have to do is figure out what's anterior, posterior, lateral, and medial. You can imagine that this is the anterior side and this is the posterior side. Here's the lateral side, and then of course in the middle, median, this is the deep center part of it. You can imagine that, why do we try to start off with that? Well, especially with spinal cord, it is imperative that you know what's anterior and posterior, also known as ventral and dorsal. So you may hear me go back and forth, but they're synonymous. Ventral is anterior, dorsal is posterior. But part of the reason why is because things are named anterior and posterior, and they are specifically, functionally, and anatomically different, and so you would get it wrong on the examination. So keep in mind, that's the first thing you should ever do when you step up to a spinal cord model or try to figure out anterior and posterior. Let me give you some hints. The first one is this big, gigantic, gaping kind of cleavage furrow in the front in comparison to this little crack in the back. And this would be the anterior median fissure, much deeper, wider, in comparison to the smaller posterior median sulcus, which is a little bit tinier. And that's one of the first ways that I would look at it. You know, you can see this on a slide. You'll find a little bigger gap or a smaller one. Now you know that this side would be anterior or ventral. If, say, for instance, you can't see it, then I go to my second kind of go-to tell, and that is the horns. The gray matter is arranged in like this butterfly, and so the anterior horn, for some reason, doesn't go to the outer portion of this white matter. As you can see, white matter, of course, is axons. Gray matter is cell bodies. And so this collection, the way that we arrange it is the cell bodies stay and hang out just like right here, while all the axons continue out this way. On the ventral horn, or the anterior gray horn, and that's what this is called, it never touches the edge. In comparison, if you follow way back here, you'll notice that the posterior or the dorsal gray horn does kind of touch the border of the posterior side. So I always think, oh, horns go all the way to the back. And so that's the second way to tell. But say, for instance, you can't really see, it's kind of hard to see, the stain is off. How can I get one more chance? Well, you can actually follow the roots here. So these are roots that come off of the spinal cord. So this would be the ventral or anterior root, motor only. And then this is the posterior or dorsal root, sensory only, and then you'll see that the dorsal root swells to this gigantic, huge kind of swelling. We call swellings ganglions, and so this is a ganglion here, right on the dorsal root, so we call it the dorsal root ganglion, also known as the posterior root ganglion. It's just a collection of cell bodies because those sensory fibers are pseudo-unipolar, so all the cell bodies get conglomerated in here, and they make things swell. Please keep that in mind, that every little bit of this is created by neurons. Every little bit. And so if you have less neurons, well, it's going to get smaller. If you have more neurons, it's going to get bigger. If you have cell bodies, it's going to, of course, get thicker. And so that's what we find as the posterior root ganglion or dorsal root ganglion. So if you have those three, you already know that this is anterior and posterior, and then this is lateral, and everything then falls kind of in step as long as you know what they are. So you already know anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus, anterior gray horn, posterior gray horn. When they come together, they're called the gray commissure, and then of course the little central canal or central hole in there is called the central canal. The white matter, this is the posterior white column, this is the anterior white column, and then this would be the lateral white column. And you can imagine, oh, they're all named according to directional terms. Yes, and yes, and yes. And so then we still have the ventral root, or in the dorsal root, with the dorsal root ganglion. When they join together and they kind of fuse, you can see this over here, they become the mixed spinal nerve. When the mixed spinal nerve then splits, you get the posterior ramus and then the anterior ramus, or also known as the dorsal ramus, and the ventral ramus, and both of these just mean branch, and so it's a branch off of this the mixed spinal nerve. These are mixed, both carrying both motor and sensory, same with like the mixed spinal nerve, motor and sensory. They just go in different locations. So the ventral goes to the anterior side of the body, the posterior goes to that little strip in the back of your body. And so let's review. So if I were to be here, you could see this is the anterior median fissure, this is the posterior median sulcus, this is the anterior gray horn, this is the posterior gray horn with the gray commissure touching and making these guys connect. Central canal with the posterior white column in the posterior side, the ventral white column or the anterior white column on the anterior side, and then the lateral white columns on the side. They give off roots, the anterior root, the posterior root. The posterior root has a ganglion, so this is the posterior root ganglion or the dorsal root ganglion. They join together, they turn into mixed spinal nerve, and then they become the anterior or ventral ramus, and then the posterior or the dorsal ramus. You can see all these patterns be very similar in a second model. If I were to just step over here, notice you can identify everything. They look very, very pattern-like. This is a little bit more characterized. As you can see, this is, of course, the anterior great horn, the posterior great horn. This is the ventral root. This is the dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion, a little swelling here, and then when they join, this becomes the mixed spinal nerve. One more shot, you can be able to see these guys branch off. You can see here, same kind of pattern. There's the gigantic anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. You can see then the anterior great horn, posterior great horn. This one does have the intermedial lateral great horn, so it's something unique found in the thoracic region up to L2. And then you get the ventral root, dorsal root ganglion joins with the mixed spinal nerve here, and then of course the dorsal ramus is the guy that pops out here. This is the ventral ramus coming off of here. One clear exception is only in the areas of the thoracic you get these two little rami communicans, and that's something with autonomic nerve fibers. You get a gray and a white rami communicans, these tiny little guys that come off of the mixed spinal nerve. You can see it kind of here in the cervical region, but you only have a gray rami communicans coming off of this guy here. And just know that it's mainly for autonomic functions. There are neurons that carry autonomic innervation. Otherwise, everything is fairly unremarkable. You can still see the coverings on this. You can see the dura mater all the way here with the arachnoid kind of fused with this space being the arachnoid, subarachnoid space, filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and then the covering over the actual spinal cord, that's the pia mater. You can see the dural root sleeves that kind of live on the actual spinal nerve and just kind of wrap around them and then protect it from leaking CSF. And that is the spinal cord.